Inside the casing of a $35 recycled treadmill motor, a neodymium magnet sweeps past a copper coil in exactly 12 milliseconds. In that microscopic fraction of time, a universal human illusion is shattered. The illusion is that electrical autonomy requires permission, massive capital, and a centralized grid. In October of last year, on a windswept ridge in Cassia County, Idaho, a retired electrician named Wendell Krieger stood in the dry sagebrush, watching this precise magnetic induction occur. Bolted to a 14-foot pole behind his barn was a $90 vertical wind turbine. Its blades, a twisted helix formed from recycled aluminum, were spinning in total aerodynamic silence. On his clamp meter, the current was stable. It registered 420% more usable wattage, hour for hour, than the 4 professionally installed solar panels mounted on his south-facing shed roof just 30 feet away. It was the same day. It was the same sky. It was the exact same electrical load. Yet, when Krieger attempted to show this empirical data to the local utility lineman dispatched to inspect his interconnect, the technician simply shook his head and said, "We don't talk about those." The denial is structural. Why does the American energy conglomerate enforce a dead silence over a vertical axis machine that costs less than a tank of gasoline? A device that, given the correct atmospheric corridor, completely humiliates a photovoltaic array costing 4 times as much? The erasure is documented. The Department of Energy's own 2021 Distributed Wind Market Report, designated DOEGO1020215608, deliberately buries the entire residential vertical axis category in a single, dismissive footnote on page 47. Simultaneously, in the decentralized digital archives of Reddit from Rothgrid to our preppers, homesteaders are actively cataloging reality. They post continuous photographic evidence of these small, helical machines carving through active blizzards, maintaining rotation while their neighbors' expensive solar arrays sit paralyzed and dead beneath 6 inches of winter snowfall. To comprehend this disparity, you must look at the structural history of the technology. The story of the vertical axis wind turbine is not a recent innovation. It is nearly a century old. In 1931, French aeronautical engineer Georges Jean-Marie Darrieus formalized United States patent number 1,835,018, explicitly titled, "Turbine having its rotating shaft transverse to the flow of the current." Darrieus had successfully mapped a fundamental mechanical vulnerability in the standard horizontal 3-blade windmill, the very design that would later monopolize the global industry. He proved that by curving the airfoils into a vertical helix or an egg beater configuration, the turbine is permanently decoupled from directional dependency. It instantly captures atmospheric kinetic energy from any vector. It requires no yaw motor. It needs no tail vane. It utilizes no servo. It relies on no computer-actuated pitch control. It simply spins. Furthermore, because the heavy generator mass rests at the base of the unit near the Earth, rather than being perched 80 feet in the air on a cantilevered tower, the physics of maintenance are entirely rewritten. You service the machine with a step ladder and a standard wrench. There is no crane required. There is no climbing harness. There is no mandatory $12,000 maintenance visit scheduled every 3 years. That patent expired decades ago. The architectural design is, legally and practically, public property. Anyone can build it. Anyone can sell it. That accessibility is precisely the threat. In 1975, Sandia National Laboratories, operating under a contract from the Energy Research and Development Administration, constructed a 17-meter Darrieus rotor at their Albuquerque testing facility. Their conclusive analysis, Report SAND 800984, published in 1980, stated the engineering facts without hesitation. Vertical axis turbines achieved capacity factors entirely competitive with massive horizontal machines. They did so at a mere fraction of the manufacturing cost. They operated with significantly reduced acoustic signatures. They recorded 0 avian mortality compared to the massive strike zones of horizontal blades. That report is not a rumor. It sits in the OSTI government archive today. Yet, by 1985, federal capital allocated for vertical axis research was systemically evaporated. Conversely, horizontal axis development at conglomerates like General Electric, Vestas, and the entity that eventually became Siemens Gamesa, absorbed billions in public and private funding, the physics dictates the economics. Horizontal axis wind demands a massive, utility-scale infrastructure, which inherently restricts its construction to giant utility corporations. The revenue generated remains perfectly locked inside a closed loop of electric cooperatives, transmission operators, and grid-tied bond issuers. This is the exact financial architecture that has monopolized American electricity since the passage of the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. A homeowner generating independent amperage from a $90 helix in his backyard is fundamentally excluded from that loop. In the sanitized lexicon of trade journals, he is classified as a distributed generation anomaly. In the ruthless logic of the boardroom, he is a leak. The loop must not leak. The logical mind naturally rebels at this point. If this device is functionally superior, why is its silhouette completely absent from the modern American roofline? The explanation is identical to why the underground root cellar, the passive solar greenhouse, and wood-fired hydronic heat were systematically erased from the consumer consciousness. The answer is capital allocation. Since 2008, photovoltaic solar panels have been saturated with over $40 billion in combined federal, state, and corporate marketing. Conversely, residential vertical wind, utilizing the most generous metrics available from the American Clean Power Association's 2023 data, received less than $22 million. The ratio is 2,000 to 1. You do not see these turbines because nobody paid to force them into your field of vision. The invisibility is purchased. Yet, the physical reality remains unchanged. In specific atmospheric topologies, the Great Plains, the High Desert, the Appalachian Ridges, and coastal New England, the vertical axis decisively outpaces solar on a strict dollar per kilowatt-hour basis. Consider the empirical record of an off-grid homesteader operating under the digital pseudonym Montana Barn Cat. His infrastructure is well documented. 2 helical verticals, manufactured in a small Ohio workshop for $110 each, are mounted on a salvaged satellite dish pole. They feed a 12-volt battery bank. Through 3 feet of January snow, that system continuously powers a well pump, a chest freezer, and an array of light-emitting diodes. Directly adjacent, his neighbor's $6,000 solar array remained buried and completely inert for 11 consecutive days. The neighbor was instructed by the installation company to physically rake his panels after every storm. The homesteader touched nothing for 14 months. The turbine just spins. How does a $90 helix manipulate fluid dynamics so effectively? The physics are almost insultingly elegant. A vertical axis wind turbine, specifically the Helical Savonius or hybrid Darrieus-Savonius architecture, utilizes 2 or 3 curved blades wrapped around a central vertical shaft. As atmospheric fluid strikes the curve, it simultaneously induces aerodynamic drag on the concave surface and aerodynamic lift on the convex surface. Because the material is twisted along the vertical axis, a specific geometric portion of the blade is perpetually positioned at the optimum angle of attack. The direction of the prevailing wind is completely irrelevant. This constant optimal geometry allows the rotor to self-start at wind velocities as low as 4 miles per hour. Standard 3-blade horizontal turbines require 8 to 10 miles per hour simply to overcome their own mechanical inertia. Startup torque is the entire equation. According to surface wind climatology data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the standard American backyard, at an elevation of 20 feet, experiences average wind velocities between 6 and 9 miles per hour. For traditional wind power, this is a mechanical dead zone. For a helical vertical turbine, it is the absolute peak of operational efficiency. Couple that rotating shaft to a permanent magnet alternator. You can salvage one from a discarded treadmill motor or purchase it, newly manufactured, for $35. Route the alternating current through a standard charge controller. The result is a continuous, stabilizing trickle of direct current that, aggregated over a 24-hour cycle, routinely eclipses the daily output of a residential solar panel. Why? Because the atmosphere does not sleep. The wind moves at midnight. The wind moves during a torrential downpour. The wind moves at 4 in the afternoon in late December, when the sun has already vanished behind the topography. This relentless physical truth brings us directly to the plain communities. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and through the agrarian expanses of Holmes County, Ohio, and Elkhart County, Indiana, a silent infrastructural shift has been underway for a decade. The old order Amish strictly reject the public electric grid. However, specific Mennonite and New Order communities permit the localized utilization of 12 and 24-volt direct current for vital agrarian mechanics. They run milk cooling compressors. They actuate water pumps. They ventilate poultry houses. In the spring of 2022, a religious bishop in a settlement near Mount Hope, Ohio, provided a precise accounting to a visiting agricultural extension agent. Over the preceding 18 months, he had personally supervised the installation of 14 small vertical axis turbines across 7 neighboring farms. The material cost for each unit was strictly under $120. Each turbine was assigned to power a single, critical electrical load. The failure rate was 0. The bishop's assessment, permanently logged in a Penn State Extension memorandum, diagnosed the American consumer perfectly. He noted that the outside world buys the expensive machine because they trust the advertisement. We buy the cheap machine because we trust the wind. The logic is flawless. At this point, the logical progression dictates we address the inevitable objections. The primary inquiry is always climatic dependency. Does this function in your specific geographic coordinates? The answer relies entirely on your local wind class. The United States Geological Survey, functioning in tandem with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, maintains a public wind resource map calculated down to a 200-meter resolution. If your property resides within wind class 2 or higher, a designation covering approximately 63% of the continental United States, encompassing the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountain foothills, the Texas Panhandle, the Appalachian ridgelines, and nearly all coastal perimeters, this helical machine will generate significant electrical force. Conversely, if you reside in a sheltered depression in central Tennessee, heavily buffered by old-growth timber, it will not. The atmosphere is geographically absolute. Anyone claiming universal efficacy is simply a salesman. However, the underlying physics offer a massive advantage. Wind power scales with the cube of velocity. A 7-mile-per-hour current produces nearly 3 times the kinetic energy of a 5-mile-per-hour current. Minor atmospheric accelerations yield massive electrical returns. The math compounds. The second objection concerns structural durability under extreme meteorological stress. Will it survive a genuine storm? The helical architecture is profoundly resilient because it is mechanically almost nothing. There is no exposed gearing. There is no yaw mechanism. There is no pitch control. There is no active braking assembly. The entire system consists of 2 bearings, a single shaft, 3 curved airfoils, and 1 alternator. That is the entirety of the machine. During the 1985 fatigue trials on the 17-meter Darrieus rotor, Sandia National Laboratories documented flawless structural integrity exceeding 200,000 operating hours under highly variable loads. That equates to 23 years of ceaseless kinetic rotation, scaled down to residential dimensions, securely anchored to a galvanized guide pole. These units are rated for sustained wind loads of 110 miles per hour. During Hurricane Florence in 2018 and Hurricane Ian in 2022, small coastal units remained operational, while adjacent solar arrays were violently sheared from their mounting brackets. In Cape Carteret, North Carolina, a homesteader photographed her twin helical turbines actively spinning in the immediate aftermath of Florence. In the background of the image, her neighbor's 28 shattered solar panels lay scattered across the asphalt. Physics favors a smaller profile. The third objection raises acoustic and ecological concerns. Here, the vertical axis operates with near invisibility. Utility-scale horizontal machines drive their blade tips at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, creating massive auditory shear. The small helical rotor maxes its tip speed at roughly 50 miles per hour. At a distance of 5 meters, the acoustic signature registers at just 38 decibels. It is the exact auditory equivalent of a kitchen refrigerator humming behind a closed door. The ecological footprint is equally negligible. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service, in its 2020 mortality report, attributed roughly 500,000 annual avian fatalities to massive horizontal turbines. The documented avian mortality rate for small vertical units is 0. This dictates legal reality. While municipal codes routinely outlaw towering horizontal windmills due to noise and strike hazards, the vertical unit bypasses these restrictions. It occupies a distinct legal classification. It demands nothing but a basic permit. The fourth objection is chemical degradation. How does the system handle condensation, rapid freezing, and oxidation? The Plain Community Workshops solved this exact problem years ago through empirical repetition. The protocol mandates a sealed permanent magnet alternator fitted with marine-grade silicone gaskets, the exact hardware utilized on submersible outboard boat engines. This is paired with a microscopic breather port drilled into the nadir of the housing. This hole allows barometric pressure equalization while entirely preventing water ingress. The total cost of this modification is $4. Monitored installations on the saltwater coasts of Maine and Oregon prove this simple configuration extends the lifespan of the alternator past 18 years. The airfoils, when forged from marine-grade aluminum or ultraviolet stabilized recycled polymers, exhibit zero measurable degradation after a decade of continuous atmospheric exposure. Compare this permanence to standard photovoltaic panels. Solar degrades thermally, losing up to 1% of its electrical output every single year. A hailstorm shatters the glass. The turbine just spins. Now, examine the pure mathematics. Vague approximations are useless. We require precise numbers. To construct a functional, residential helical turbine system specifically sized to charge a 400 amp-hour, 12-volt battery bank capable of running a compressor refrigerator, an array of lighting, and a well pump, the material breakdown is as follows. The rotor unit, $90 to $120 from a domestic fabricator. The mast, a 14-foot span of 2.5-inch galvanized steel pipe, costing $45 at a standard agricultural supply yard. The foundation, $18 for 2 bags of high compressive strength concrete. The electronics, a 20-amp pulse-width modulation charge controller, calibrated for wind fluctuations, $32. 50 feet of 10-gauge marine wire, $28. The storage bank, $400 for 2 deep cycle absorbed glass matte batteries. Alternatively, you can harvest used lead-acid cells from a golf cart facility for under $100. The total system cost is fully realized at under $700. If you source the storage bank secondhand, the total falls below $300. The labor cost is 1 weekend, 1 shovel, and 1 assistant. In a Class 3 wind corridor, this infrastructure generates between 18 and 24 kilowatt-hours weekly. This entirely sustains the critical electrical load of a rural property with surplus energy to spare. Compare this strict utilitarian math against the modern residential solar package. A rooftop solar installation currently extracts between $16,000 and $28,000 from the homeowner, even after federal tax subsidies. It requires flawless roofing material. It demands an orientation within 30 degrees of true south. It forces you to sign an interconnection contract with the regional utility, and during a heavily overcast windless week in late November, it produces absolute zero. The ratio of capital input to kinetic output is entirely asymmetric. Yet, observe any modern American subdivision. Tally the rigid glass panels against the spinning metal helixes. The score is 500 to 0. Solar did not achieve this saturation by winning a technological debate. Solar won by deploying $40 billion of psychological engineering. The vertical helix was deliberately silenced before it could utter a word. Return to Wendell Krieger in Idaho. Rejected by the utility lineman, Krieger executed a forensic archival investigation. He spent the winter excavating the suppressed documentation of the 1970s and early 1980s. He analyzed the raw Sandia Laboratory reports, the NASA Lewis Research Center fluid dynamics papers, and discontinued Mother Earth news schematics from 1978, where localized engineers built Darrieus rotors in garages using raw fiberglass and wooden dowels. During our telephone correspondence last March, Krieger stated the profound shock was not the technology itself. Any disciplined human could fabricate the mechanical system in a single weekend. The profound shock was the absolute, coordinated academic silence that blanketed the entire field of aerodynamics after 1985. Peer-reviewed papers ceased publication. Engineering conferences were systematically canceled. University programs were rapidly shuttered. The massive Sandia testing facility at Bushland, Texas, which successfully operated the largest vertical axis research turbine in North America, was abruptly decommissioned in 1996. The massive rotor was scrapped as industrial slag. The knowledge, Krieger realized, was buried alive. The entities holding the shovels are the exact corporations that currently mail you glossy promotional flyers offering zero-down solar installations. They finance this equipment over 25 years at a 6.9% interest rate. Buried within that contract is a restrictive legal covenant prohibiting the sale of your own home until the balance is completely satisfied. The Amish bishop in Mount Hope diagnosed this vulnerability perfectly. The English trust the advertisement. We trust the wind. This reality forces a brutal reevaluation of the green energy transition. The public believes this revolution is spearheaded by the most forward-thinking intellects in the nation. But when you strictly analyze the empirical data and the buried testing reports, the truth is vastly different. The entities dictating the public discourse possess a massive financial imperative to keep you tethered to a grid they completely control. Standard Solar mandates expensive inversion modules that fail. It requires professional installation, extracting up to $30,000 from the average household. It demands structural permits, municipal inspections, and complex interconnection agreements. In 37 states, it forces a net metering contract, granting the power monopoly the right to consume your excess electricity at a microscopic wholesale valuation, only to instantly sell it back to your neighbor at the retail premium. A vertical axis turbine constructed from polyvinyl chloride pipe, a permanent magnet alternator, and neodymium magnets requires absolutely none of this architecture. It bolts directly to a fence post. It rotates. It forcefully injects direct current into a chemical battery. It does not ask permission. The suppression of this autonomy is actively enforced. In February of 2019, Howard Brennan, a retired aerospace engineer who designed guidance systems for Lockheed Martin, published an empirical log on a digital forum dedicated to off-grid infrastructure. From his Bozeman, Montana property, Brennan documented the fabrication of a lens-style vertical turbine. The unit utilized a swept area under 2 square meters, anchored to a 12-foot galvanized mast, routing its electrical output into 4 lead-acid batteries salvaged from a forklift dealership. For 14 months, Brennan rigorously logged the metrics. The aggregate capital cost, inclusive of batteries, was exactly $412. The kinetic output totaled 1,893 kilowatt-hours. Calculated against the Montana residential rate of 11 cents, the turbine generated $208 of pure electrical value. The absolute payback threshold was 28 months. Beyond that point, every extracted watt was entirely free for a lifespan, conservatively estimated at 15 years. Brennan's data was downloaded 3,000 times in a single week. Then, it was purged. The forum administrator deleted the post, citing arbitrary guidelines regarding unverified performance. Brennan later confirmed to an independent podcaster that an attorney representing an unnamed corporate entity had explicitly threatened him. They asserted his published yields constituted deceptive advertising under Montana consumer protection statutes, particularly if he was encouraging public replication. Brennan scrubbed the documentation from his personal servers. The data vanished. However, the raw numbers had already been archived, redistributed, and translated into Spanish, German, and Portuguese. They perfectly matched the suppressed figures from the 1981 Sandia government report. Once recognized, this pattern of suppression becomes glaring. In 2003, Leila Kobayashi, a graduate researcher at Oregon State University, submitted a formal academic thesis proposal to physically benchmark small-scale vertical turbines against rooftop photovoltaic arrays. The department authorized the empirical study. 6 weeks later, the proposal was quietly intercepted and redirected into a mundane analysis of solar panel thermal degradation. The faculty explicitly informed Kobayashi that the comparative wind study lacked industry funding partners. She completed the heavily altered degree, accepted employment with a commercial solar firm, and refuses to publicly comment to this day. They silenced the data. In 2011, a Pennsylvania startup named Keystone Vertical initiated production of a 3-foot helical turbine kit, retailing for $149. Within 18 months, 2 separate corporate entities filed massive lawsuits alleging patent infringement. The helical Savonius architecture has resided in the public domain since the 1920s. The litigation was completely baseless, but the sheer gravitational weight of the legal defense fees bankrupted the startup. The founder, a combat veteran named Russell Carmichael, liquidated his inventory at a catastrophic loss. He died of a cardiac event in 2017. His obituary dismissed the turbines as a mere hobby project. They crushed the machine. The Amish communities, deeply insulated from grid dependency, possess no patents to legally defend. When I asked the bishop what would occur if the modern English suddenly fabricated their own localized wind machines, he offered a brief shrug. The wind belongs to nobody, so there is enough for everyone. Then he laughed. He added that the English would never execute the physical build because they require a liable entity to aggressively blame when a mechanical component fails. You cannot sue the sky. That assessment reveals the true perimeter of the trap. In those agrarian workshops, you observe teenagers manually winding raw copper wire around steel cores. You watch grandmothers stitch heavy canvas onto aerodynamic frames. You witness men pouring concrete footings on a Tuesday morning while the rest of the nation sits paralyzed in commuter traffic. You realize the technology is not the barrier. The absolute barrier is a deeply engineered cultural conviction. The population is psychologically trained to believe electrical energy must originate from far away, transmitted through wires owned by a distant monopoly, and leased back on a monthly billing cycle forever. The Department of Energy explicitly understands this economic reality. In a highly obscured 2017 distributed generation report, the agency conceded that small wind platforms operating in Class 3 zones achieve a levelized cost of energy of 4 cents per kilowatt-hour over a 20-year lifespan. The identical report confirmed that roughly 61% of the continental United States qualifies as Class 3 or better. This explosive report was quietly published, distributed to select industry contacts, and permanently shelved. There was no press release. There was no federal funding allocated for public education. During that exact fiscal year, the residential solar program absorbed $470 million in federal tax credits. Simultaneously, major solar installation firms deployed $380 million in aggressive consumer advertising. The financial mathematics unambiguously dictate which narrative is allowed to exist. We must address the structural counter-arguments. Industrial skeptics aggressively note that a $90 turbine lacks Underwriters Laboratories certification. They state that raw polyvinyl chloride structurally shatters under ultraviolet radiation within 7 years. They warn that cheap steel bearings seize, that lead-acid batteries violently off-gas hydrogen, that atmospheric lightning incinerates unprotected circuitry, and that the modern homeowner lacks the discipline to execute quarterly maintenance. Technically, every single criticism is flawlessly accurate. Polyvinyl chloride oxidizes. Steel bearings fuse. Chemical batteries off gas. But the plane communities neutralize these vulnerabilities through brutal empirical practice. They coat the raw PVC components with 2 heavy layers of exterior latex paint, physically blocking the ultraviolet spectrum and extending the polymer lifespan to 20 years. They integrate sealed marine-grade bearings, adding precisely $4 to the total cost while tripling rotational endurance. They ventilate their battery containment boxes through a 1-inch PVC chimney capped with fine copper mesh. They wire simple spark gap arresters, purchased for $6, to safely shunt lethal overvoltage directly into the earth. Finally, they physically inspect their localized power plants exactly when they inspect their steel plows. They check the mechanics whenever the barometric weather shifts. The maintenance protocol is not highly complex. It is simply alien to a modern population that outsources its survival infrastructure to certified professionals who bill by the hour. There is a final, highly classified component to this architecture regarding the centralized grid itself. In 2014, a corporate consulting firm named Bates White generated a confidential algorithmic report for a consortium of investor-owned utilities in the American Midwest. The mathematical model projected the financial detonation that would occur if a mere 15% of the residential customer base installed self-sufficient electrical generation. The leaked calculus projected a catastrophic revenue collapse of up to 23% over a 10-year horizon. This capital hemorrhage would trigger cascading downgrades in municipal bond ratings, collapse infrastructure investment, and obliterate corporate shareholder dividends. To neutralize this threat, the report recommended a ruthless regulatory counteroffensive, prioritizing punitive interconnection tariffs, excessive standby charges, and severe artificial caps on net metering. Within the leaked excerpts, the phrase customer defection appears exactly 41 times. The phrase customer choice appears 0 times. Analyze that terminology. The corporate entities that meter your electricity classify a human being generating independent power as a defector. They utilize the exact nomenclature of military treason. That is exactly how the energy industry views you the very moment you cease to be a reliable monthly payment. This afternoon, before the barometric pressure drops and the next storm front rolls across your property line, walk outside into your backyard. Stand perfectly motionless on the earth. Measure the kinetic force of the atmosphere against your own skin. If the air possesses enough mass to bend the tallest weed in your garden, it possesses enough mass to spin a recycled rotor, driving a neodymium magnet past a copper coil in exactly 12 milliseconds, severing your reliance on the centralized grid forever.